I'm here in the Royal Marine Hotel in Dublin, and there's about to be a climate talk by none other than Professor Ian Plimer or Plimer, which is better?
Plimer.
Plimer.
Or if you're in Scotland, Plimer. It's a Midlothian name.
We don't worry about Scotland. So, hey, this is a huge pleasure. Would you believe, Ian, only yesterday I got an email from a kind of climate group in Ireland who are involved with the crew who are setting this talk up. And I said, in Dublin? So I immediately emailed, delighted you came back and said you could do this interview before your talk. So, you know, I'd start first with your scientific bio, your background, kind of compressed in brief, but the highlights of your expertise.
When I finished my degree, my first job was to work underground with miners at about a mile underground, and these are people who are real people. And all of a sudden you realise a lot of what you were taught at university was nonsense. These people were practical people and their life depended upon getting it right underground. And after that I went and did a PhD, and I did that on a mineral deposit underground. Then I went and worked in the mining industry for a little while, and I left the mining industry when I was a passenger in a corporate jet, and we ran out of fuel at 31,000 feet and crashed, and I lived. And by then I had 3 young children, and I'd had an offer from a university. I thought I'd better go back to university while the kids are young. And I was in a university, very quickly became a chair, a professor and head at Newcastle in Australia, professor in Munich in Germany, professor and head of Earth Sciences in Melbourne, which is the most prestigious university in Australia. And that, in my department, I had geophysics, geology, meteorology, and these meteorologists later relabelled themselves as climate change experts. And then after that I was professor at the University of Adelaide. When I finished up at Adelaide, and that's where I live, I then moved back into the mining industry, but at a more senior level. Now, I've spent my life asking questions, and in the mining industry you test models, and you test them with a drill hole, and if you get it wrong, you often get sacked. Whereas in the climate industry, if you test a model and it's wrong, you apply for another research grant to create another model, and you get promoted. So the contrasts between my 2 lives have been great, really great.
Wow, excellent. So you're in a great position then to judge all of this field. I shouldn't probably even call it a field, but why would you be against supposedly 97% or 90% of, quote, scientists?
Well, we've had climate change going on since a Tuesday 4,567 million years ago, and it's always changed. And for 80% of time, it's been warmer and wetter than now. We've also had 3 atmospheres in the history of the planet. The first was hydrogen and helium rich. The second, which dominated for about 80% of time, was carbon dioxide rich, and the third now is oxygen rich. Now, when we had this carbon dioxide rich atmosphere, we actually had ice ages. And we had ice ages at the equator, and we had ice at sea level, and we had kilometres of ice at sea level at the equator, yet the atmospheric carbon dioxide content was 20%. And we're told that at 0.04%, if we increase it by a little bit, we're going to have runaway global warming. We didn't have it in the past. So why should we have it in the present? So we geologists see that this is a load of nonsense. So straight away from that aspect, I say, well, no, this is nonsense. When we look over time, we see that carbon dioxide has decreased over time. And it's decreased from when we first had complex life on Earth to a very low figure now. And we've sequestered that carbon dioxide into shells, into limey sediments, into coral reefs, into coals, into oils. And we've been pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere for 500 million years. We are at a dangerously low level. If we halved the carbon dioxide content, we would have no life on Earth. So we should be doing what Patrick Moore, who founded Greenpeace, said. We should be burning fossil fuels and putting that carbon dioxide in the air, because I'm of the girth now where I can't hug trees, but I can feed them by burning and putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
Yeah, Moore was superb. In my early research into this crazy area, I came across him. But yeah, that all these sea creatures that died sequestered all of this carbon into their shells.
It's gone into limestones, into fossilised limestones.
Stone.
Ireland is full of these limestones, full of shells. Much of Ireland was tropical, and the limestones deposited here were in very warm water limestones. So climate has always changed, and much of Ireland is now covered by glacial debris. It was once under ice. And as I've come to see the rugby tomorrow in Ireland, one would have hoped that the ice was still here. Then we would have had a tough game, which I think it will be.
Excellent. Well, you know, as Moore said though, these creatures unwittingly would have caused an extinction of plant life by stealing the carbon dioxide, not intentionally, obviously. It would have been a disaster when it got down to maybe 0.02, 0.016. And just before that disaster happened, might have happened over the next tens of thousands of years, I guess, humans happened, you know, with the Industrial Revolution, to start putting just a little bit back in. So 0.02 something up to 0.04 now. We've just put in a little soupçon, a frisson of extra carbon dioxide.
Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. We've got cycles of climate, and these cycles are every time we have continents pulling apart or stitching together, every time we've got a bad address in the galaxy, which is every 143 million years, every time we're closer or further from the sun, and these are the Milankovitch cycles, every 100,000, 40,000 and 20,000 years. And there's just been a new cycle found, and that's based on Martian cycles, and that's every 2.4 million years. And we also have solar cycles, and we also have lunar tidal cycles, and we also have oceanic cycles. But the cycles which really drive our climate, and you know, you heard it here first, is that great ball of heat in the sky called the sun. You wouldn't believe it, but that actually drives climate. And sometimes it puts out a bit more energy, sometimes a bit less, sometimes we're far from the sun, sometimes we're closer to the sun. That drives the climate of planet Earth. There are other factors which drive climate changes, but what we see as geologists from looking back in time is we've never seen a climate change driven by carbon dioxide. What happens is if we get a warming, then later we release carbon dioxide out of the oceans. If we get a cooling, later we dissolve carbon dioxide in the oceans. And when we have a period when the planet is covered with a lot of ice, down to about 38 degrees south and north, then that's when we have low carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, down to 180, 200 parts per million. That's when we almost wipe out life. And then after we come back into a natural warming, we increase the carbon dioxide content. Now, we have been increasing carbon dioxide since the Industrial Revolution, and the questions which can never be answered are, is this due to warming after the medieval warming? Is it due to warming after the Roman warming? Is it due to the fact that we are in an interglacial that started 14,500 years ago, peaked about 5,000 years ago, and now we're on a long cooling trend with warmer spikes in Minoan, Roman, medieval and modern times? Is the warming we see today, and there is very slight warming, is it a natural warming or is it driven by carbon dioxide? Now, there's many of us that are searching desperately for the evidence to see that humans have driven this. And if you ask scientists, and I've done this for 2 decades now, asking scientists a basic question, and the latest victim was a chap at the Scott Polar Institute at Cambridge University. I said, well, please show me the evidence that human emissions drive global warming. Just give me half a dozen scientific papers. He obfuscated, never gave me a paper. Now, I've been asking scientists that for 25 years. Just give me some landmark scientific papers that demonstrate that human emissions drive global warming. So we've never seen the evidence. I can give you all the contrary evidence to show that it's absolute nonsense, but I haven't seen anything that has built a whole house of cards, totally rewiring the Western world, changing our energy systems and creating these scams where people can make a fortune out of solar and wind power.
And you know, yeah, you touched on that, and I've used for a decade now Professor Karl Popper, the asymmetry of proof. In other words, you can have many, many bits of evidence to suggest something is true, let's say climate change, and none of them prove it. But if you have one marked negative contrary piece of evidence, it's disproven. And in your case, like with the previous things I was involved in, like medicine and health and metabolism, what you found is, there are loads of contrary proofs, or not proofs, but contrary bits of evidence, any of which would kill it. But they don't even have a lot of positives, which are...
starting with Karl Popper, his refutation is what science is about. And in science, we also have what's called the coherence criterion. In other words, if evidence from here builds a case, if you go into a different field of science and you have contrary evidence, then you have to dismiss the theory. And geology provides you with that contrary evidence. Therefore, you must dismiss the hypothesis that human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming. Now, perish the thought, but what happens if I'm wrong? And you then have to prove that the 97% of emissions, which are the natural emissions, don't drive global warming. So it's checkmate before you start the game. So this has got nothing to do with science. It's got nothing to do with climate. It's got nothing to do with the environment. It is the new religion. And it is a new religion where you pay your indulgences, which is your higher electricity costs. You have a holy book, which is the IPCC reports, and like most holy books, people haven't read them. And you have your gurus and your prophets who are there profiting by being a prophet. And you follow on and you believe. So you often get the question, do you believe in climate change? And I say, belief is a word you use in politics and religion. In science, your conclusion is married to evidence. If you get contrary or new evidence, you change your conclusion.
And you debate around the evidence.
You debate, and there's no such thing as settled science. Up until earlier this year, we didn't know that there was a Martian climate cycle. We now know that.
Yeah, and Coonan as well, I think he wrote the book Unsettled. I think he's been a pretty good guy, and he was the science advisor to Obama, and like incredible level of achievement. But of course he gets squeezed too. And the other word that drives me, infuriates me, I'm sure it does you, Ian, denier. Because denier is another word totally from the realm of religion. I mean, denier. There's no such thing as denying a science. There is proposing a different view based on evidence.
Well, as soon as someone says the word denier, I say, well, you're not a scientist. That's
exactly.
That's not in the scientific lexicon. Science is married to evidence. And that evidence comes from experiment, from observation. That evidence has to be repeated time and time and time again. And eventually you'll feel comfortable that that scientific theory may well be valid. Now, I've had to do this in my own work, in some of my own research work. I've published work, and then later I thought, shit, I might be wrong on this. And I went right back and collected a whole lot of new data and published criticising my own work. And showing that some of my earlier publications, done when I was in my 30s, were wrong. That I've got better data and more data now showing I have a more refined theory. Now, I might not be correct, but we've been able to demonstrate that I'm probably closer to being correct than I was previously. And I'm happy with that. I'm happy to say what I've published has been amended by me.
Exactly. It's just a sad state of affairs, though, that is unusual these days, when traditionally it would have been almost universal. Well, maybe it wasn't. I could be wrong. I interviewed Brett Weinstein recently over in Hartford. I got him in person. Very clever guy, you know, the biologist. And he was talking about science and what it really is, like you are. And he said predictive power is a fundamental of science. That's why he hates all these models, like Ferguson with COVID, right? Or any of this climate stuff. But not only have I believe almost every prediction of the last half century from these charlatans, I would say, has proved incorrect. But as you pointed out, also you can predict backwards in a sense and look through history and see, does their guff work? And maybe we might just go through that a little bit again, the history where carbon dioxide didn't precede temperature change, it came after changes, and all the exceptions to this rule.
Well, I'll deal with two parts of that question. The first is that the climate change scare campaign is based on models. And we've now had 40 years of models which we can compare with the measurements. And the measurements are what we have measured by numerous techniques, and the models, there are about 105 of them, and they're very different. And the models overheat the planet enormously. So if you're going to make a prediction in science, then you have to be able to validate it by looking back. The models don't work. I don't use models. What I use is data. And that data I can integrate from chemistry, from physics, from astronomy, from geology, intertwine that with history and archaeology, and you get a fascinating story. And the story is of cyclical climates. The story is that there's a lot of climate change that is recorded in history, such as the Little Ice Age, such as the medieval warming, such as the Roman warming. All of this is recorded, and it's well recorded, and we can intertwine that with proxies, say looking at tree rings, looking at the size of the breathing holes in leaves called stomata, and you can work out the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And then you can look back in time by drilling ice, and it's been done in the North Pole, in Greenland, it's been done in Antarctica. And these ice drill holes have got records of time, and these are from dirty big volcanic eruptions where you leave acid and ash in those layers, and you can then measure when that ice was deposited. So you've got snow that's falling, captures a little bit of air, that air then ends up in the snow, gets compressed into ice, and you can extract that air and work out from the time you've got from the volcanic eruptions when you had high carbon dioxide, and from chemical fingerprints of the ice you can work out what the temperature was. So then you get these plots of temperature against time and against carbon dioxide. And what we find is that every time we get a natural warming event, then anything from, well, a couple of thousand years later, you find that the atmospheric carbon dioxide content increases. Now that is in accord with what we know from chemistry. That is the coherence criterion in science that's operating. That is true science, whereas the models are telling us something different. And the models are based on incomplete evidence, and the models make an assumption. And that is the trace gas in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, drives the whole process. Now, to have traces of a trace gas put into the atmosphere by humans to drive a major planetary process, all I say is pull the other one. It's got bells on it.
Well, that's the thing, and it didn't take me long a few years ago when I began to look into this to realise some of what you're saying, and discovering great people like you and Moore and all the rest. In fairness, I wasn't going to do it all myself, but the absurdity of it kind of scared me a bit. It wasn't even a debate, I could see from what you're describing and other things, but the history of where it came from, I know you don't particularly get into that, but I found out recently something, a little niggle I had. Why is Sweden so engaged with so many outfits, NGOs and government involvement? And I actually found out what it was from Dr. Jakob Nordengard. So Arrhenius in the 1800s hypothesized around this carbon dioxide having a slight potential warming effect. Fine, hypothesis. One of his students was picked up by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and the Rockefeller Foundation, the oil man. And then they poured money into him. And he was in Sweden. And that's one of the reasons Sweden is big in this. But also, essentially, all of these theories were driven from the Rockefeller Foundation and its spin-off Club of Rome. So that's kind of evidence also of a different sort, like to a detective. You would ask, well, if this is kind of nonsense, why has it come about? And then you find out it's some very, very bad characters.
Well, it's some bad characters and a very dark history. The Club of Rome has made all sorts of predictions, and if a Club of Rome makes a prediction, go down to Ladbrokes, put some money on the opposite, because you're going to win. And it's been embraced by socialists and communists as a mechanism of destroying Western industry, which is a mechanism of destroying Western civilization, and we're well down the track on that now. But anyone can work this out, and you've used logic and you've used a natural scepticism. Now, what we've had is a capture of our education system. It's been totally captured over the last 50 years, where kids are taught not to be logical thinkers, not to look back in time, not to understand history, not to be critical thinkers. And so they can accept anything that they're told, and they do. And this is probably the worst thing you can have as a kid, because it means that you can't explore different views. Everything that you get on social media is wrong, unless you can validate it from sources which often are not on social media. For example, look up Wikipedia on me. First line, they put my birth date. They've got it wrong. So don't read any more about me. Wikipedia can't even get my birth date right, and you can find that very easily by sourcing edited, refereed articles or papers or chapters. So I fear for the future of the young children who are not taught to be critical thinkers. You've got a bit of grey hair and the beard there. It shows a bit of age, and you've been through a different education system. But modern kids, they haven't got that. They haven't been taught to think. And so they're malleable. You can do anything with them. And I fear that they are going to be the ones who are going to pay the bill for what I think is the biggest scientific con we've ever had in the history of time.
Yeah, and it's essentially, it really conforms to my definition or perception around what a cult is.
Oh, very
it's
much
cult.
So. Yeah, it is a religious cult. And you either believe or you don't. And if you don't believe, you're disenfranchised, you're thrown out to the wolves. That's happened to me. I've been banned from speaking at a couple of universities. I've had an honorary doctorate that I was awarded withdrawn because of my views on climate, and the doctorate was for totally different science that I've done. I've just recently had a talk that I was going to give in Edinburgh. That one's been cancelled. It was on a totally different subject. It's been cancelled because I'm a bad guy. And my view on that is, well, as soon as that happens, you know you're winning. Because they don't argue with you. I've never had any prominent climate scientist want to debate me in public. Why not? If they're so certain of their science, they will debate a polymath like me, but they won't.
Exactly, Ian, and funny enough, I got a lot involved with this whole viral kind of nonsense the last few years, and the way it was described is, you're over the target, and it's so true. But I love that you said the debate one, because I got maligned in multiple newspapers, and one Irish newspaper was reasonable, relatively, the Irish Business Post, quite prestigious. They did a full page spread on me, and I was questioning the viral thing, and they actually printed twice what I had told them they had to print. I am open to debating anyone on this science, and I think that's really important. What happened? After that article came out, I could not get on any media, and no debates were forthcoming. So this is the way it works, but isn't it true that, you are driven to do this against your own interest? All the people who are burning up our taxes like wildfire, it's in their interest to promote it, but it's kind of against your personal interest, your career, your money. You're doing this because of the future generations.
Well, I'm doing it because even though I've spent some of my life in the mining industry, I've basically been an educator. And I'm interested in creating a generation of people who know how to think for themselves. And if they get told what to think, it's very dangerous. So I've always been in the business of education. I've always been in the business of asking questions. I've been sceptical. And to be a scientist, you have to be sceptical, including sceptical of your own views. And you have to question whether you have enough data to publish, whether the argument you put up is strong enough. A lot of scientists don't do that, and that's driven by our research grant system, where you have to publish, and you have to publish a lot of material, and you have to get accredited for that, and that then leads you on to getting promoted in your institution or getting a research grant. And there's no such thing as peer review, it's pal review. So you review what your pals do, they review what you do. It's all a closed circle. Now, I've been in that system. I was on the Australian Research Council, I sat on the German Research Council, I sat on the Swedish Research Council, and in that former life, one of the governments said, we want a war on cancer. And if you can show that ingrown toenails and cancer are related, you'll get funded. Now, if you can show that ingrown toenails and climate change are related, you'll get funded. Nothing's changed. These are fads and fashions for fools and frauds to exploit, and that's exactly what's happened. And we have really destroyed the free inquiry that our institutions have. We have journalists now who are activists rather than investigative journalists, and we have a popular paradigm, and woe betide anyone that goes against it. And I just don't care. I mean, I just don't care. I don't mind a good fight. I've started my life working underground in a mine. If that doesn't toughen you up, nothing does.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, and I see this quite a lot. A few of the doctors who really went out public during the viral kind of thing and got absolutely macerated, they were both from very, earthy backgrounds. They were not silver spoon guys. So there's an element of that gives you character that later in life you can stand up against absurdity.
With the COVID vaccine, I asked my medico two very simple questions. The first was, why haven't we stuck to the procedures that we'd used with thalidomide? After thalidomide, which I remember clearly, we had a period where everyone agreed we should have a 10-year testing of a new drug. Yeah. We didn't do it. And the second thing is, why was there legal immunity for government officials and politicians promoting new drugs? And I thought there's something not right here. I'm not medically trained, I don't understand it, but this thing just didn't smell right to me. Consequently, I haven't had any jabs. I couldn't see the reason for it.
And you weren't worried about killing Granny, no? Yeah, that was absurd. I focused more on the lockdown, the mask and all, because when it got to that stage, it got so insane. Yeah, I kind of moved on a bit to the roots of why COVID happened, and that went straight back to Rockefeller as well, unsurprisingly. Yeah. So books, actually, I want to mention these, because this one, Heaven and Earth, you wrote quite a few years ago.
I wrote that, I think it was about 2009.
Wow.
Because I had realised that there was so much nonsense about climate change. So in that book I dealt with geology, archaeology and history, looking at climate on all different scales and humans' involvement in climate, and everywhere I looked there was evidence to show it was nonsense. Now if I can do this, why can't someone else? And that book was an international bestseller. It sold about 150,000 copies, and I had a little publisher, a husband and wife with a dog and a couple of kids, and I made him, and I'm very pleased with it. And my feisty daughter says, "Dad, don't you change publishers, you're keeping a family alive," which I am. And since then he's published a couple of other books. I did a summary version of that book, and that was for school children, and I called that book How to Get Expelled from School. 101 questions to ask your teachers, and I had questions for Friday afternoon if you wanted to get thrown out of school and go and play football. I gave you the questions. I gave all the answers also. And the Labor government in Australia set up a website trying to answer these 101 questions.
Oh, they did.
And I'd written these questions such that many of them were unanswerable. And so they went in and attacked me, and they spent taxpayers' money attacking me on a government website, and as soon as we changed to a more conservative government, it went out. I had Patrick Moore, who you mentioned before. He wrote a foreword to my book, which I wrote about a spoon, a teaspoon, and how you make a teaspoon. And it's a really simple thing, the history of spoons and the history of energy use. And I called that book Not for Greens, a play on words, but it was a book about climate change, energy, eating, and the fundamentals of eating, about spoons. And then I wrote another book on the great electricity rip-off. I was locked up in lockdown in a hospital for 10 months in 2020, and I wrote a book called Green Murder, and looking at what Greens are doing to people. They're killing people. Yeah. And that I think it was the best book I wrote, Green Murder, and no punches spared. I can wallpaper the house with lawyers' letters, and that's a sign that you're hitting hard. And then I thought, well, kids are not getting a good education, so I wrote a book again when I was in hospital for an extended period of time, and I wrote it called The Little Green Book, and it was a trilogy of books, one for kids 8 to 12, another for 12 to 16, another for after 16. And I used my grandchildren for this book. How do you make kids learn about climate and what is attractive to an 8-year-old kid? So the first book, The Little Green Book, was for 8 to 12-year-olds. I wrote about farts. the carbon cycle in the body, and about farting and picking your nose, about poo and snot and everything, and how the carbon cycle worked and how ridiculous this rubbish on climate change is. And I intertwined all of that. And the second one for 12 to 16 year olds, teenagers are horrible, and they judge their parents morally. So I showed them some of the basic arguments that they might use, that we're not getting more hurricanes, we're not getting more floods, we're not getting more wildfires, we're not getting sea level change. And by the way, if you are swanning around in your electric vehicle feeling morally superior, there are kids your age in the Congo who are mining cobalt in open pit and underground mines and getting killed providing cobalt to their Chinese overlords. Is that fair to have child slavery to give you the cobalt for your electric vehicle so you can swan around feeling morally superior? And the third book was for 16-year-olds and on, and that was basically a book of the basic graphs showing that what we're being fed is absolute nonsense if you put one factor into it, and that is time. Don't worry about what's happened over the last 5, 10, 20 or 50 years. Look at thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, and again you'll see it's nonsense. And of course the latest book, which you're about to hold up, is part of a series put out by the Institute of Public Affairs in Australia. That's the oldest think tank in Australia, started in 1943. It's a free market think tank. And they put out a couple of books, Climate Change, The Facts. And I've got a chapter in there, again looking at climate over time. And that book I launched 2 weeks ago in Sydney, and there's clips of that launch floating around in the ether. I launched it last week in Perth. I'm over here now, so I do a bit of travel in my life. And I love travel because I'm burning all that fossil fuel, putting all this plant food in the atmosphere, and the plants just love me.
Yeah, well,
even though I eat them, they still love me.
Yeah, you're securing all our dinners. And you know, this book is, the timing as well, you mentioned in your excellent talk, and I'll put a link to the YouTube version down below when I release this, but the timing is pretty good. We got a shot in the arm during the election. I don't know what we really would have done if the Democrats got back in. I mean, we were in a mite of trouble. But as you rightly pointed out, there's a little bit of breathing space now. There's some more sanity in the new regime, and it's perfect timing for this book to come out. And would you see this, Ian, I guess, as a really good synopsis of all we know now in terms of evidence about this question?
Yes, there are people from all different fields in there dealing with climate, different aspects of climate, looking at what happens with life in the oceans, in the atmosphere. There's a summary of Will Happer's talks on carbon dioxide. Yes. He recently toured Australia, supported by the Institute of Public Affairs, and that's summarised. So it deals with all the aspects of climate, written for the educated reader, and I presume all of you people out there are educated.
Oh, my followers, of course.
So I think the tide is turning, and I think we've had a change which I thought would happen. I thought it might happen in my lifetime, and that is that the hip pocket was going to drive this. This was never going to, change was never going to be driven by science. It was never going to be driven by rationality or logic or the environment. It was going to be driven by inflation, the cost of energy, the lack of competitiveness, and with President-elect Trump preparing himself to basically bomb the bureaucracy as from the 20th of January 2025, I think other countries will probably have to follow because they'll find that they're not economically competitive.
Yeah, and you know, it's really, I find it fascinating because I was 20 years in people management as well, and the tricky terrain they've got to navigate. So Elon, of course, because he's making all this money from the green thing, you know, I'm sure he's smart enough to know a lot of what you're saying, but he can't really say it. And then you have Bobby Kennedy as well, came out pushing a lot of climate stuff, even though he's been incredibly logical on other matters. Yeah. So I often wonder, but there's no point musing too much.
Well, Elon Musk is going to get the world record for sacking the most number of people. You can see that coming. And
in X, he took out 80% of Twitter. And effectively nothing changed with his
So,
performance.
here it is here. Yes, I'm really worried about losing all these bureaucrats in Washington. They might actually start to be producing something rather than using other people's money.
Yeah, well, look, I think there's really good times coming, and I'm conscious of time, seeing as I mentioned that you've got your talk coming up and people are going to pile in now to mingle. So we'll bring it to a close. Climate change, the facts, go back and to heaven and earth, which is probably pretty comprehensive as well, but in specific fields.
Encyclopedic. But if you've got a short leg on the table, good. Put it under there and stop the table wobbling.
There you are. Did you mention 3,500 references?
Yes, I didn't, but there are 3,500 references in that, and in Green Murder I've got 1,500, and the reason for that is that this has got the subtitle Global Warming, the Missing Science. We get told that there's a consensus. There isn't. If you look into the Earth sciences, there are thousands of references showing that climate change is not related to human activity. So that's why I wanted to really bombard the reader with saying, look, you're not out on your own. There's a lot of science out there. You've just got to put the time into reading it. And I spent 5 years reading the science to get those references before I was comfortable enough to put it out there. And so my dean, I was then at the University of Adelaide, my dean was a biologist who was a tree-hugging greenie. He had apoplexy when he saw this book come out, but I didn't care. I mean, if you speak the truth, you never have to remember what you said.
Exactly. Only the liars need to do that. And you know, on the topic of consensus, and we've touched on this other one, so the consensus in climate science is probably as fake as the mega consensus that the mRNA magic sauce for COVID was fantastic. But it's a good comparison, maybe.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm a great believer in consensus when it refers to unicorn farts. And there's a consensus on that. And apart from that, I can't see any other consensus in science.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Professor
Thank you for having
Plimer.
me.
Thank you.